students. I am Miss Alexander, your social studies teacher. Welcome to Lesson 9. Today we are continuing with a new topic that we started the last time, which is health and well-being, and we will be looking at a new subtopic called child abuse. But before we go into today's session, we usually do a quick recap of the previous session. So in lesson 8, we learned that domestic violence affects our entire lives, including our health and our well being. When we commit to reducing domestic violence, it is a commitment to improve the health and well being of ourselves and those around us. We also learned that reducing or eliminating domestic violence in our communities, villages, regions, and the country at large requires the collective involvement of individuals, institutions, and even the government. So those are a few pointers that we focused on in lesson 8. Now let's move on to today's session. Like I started off by saying, today we will be focusing on child abuse. We will specifically look at the various forms of child abuse. So, what are our objectives for today? At the end of this session, you should be able to 1. State the various forms of child abuse, 2. Demonstrate a spirit of tolerance and sharing with children traumatized by abuse, and 3. Observe and record the findings on children who have experienced abuse in Guyana. So let's move right into it. What is child abuse? Child abuse is when a parent or caregiver, whether through an initial harm or mistreatment or failing to act, causes injury, death, emotional harm, or risk of serious harm to a child under 18 years of age. So let's now move on to forms of child abuse. There are many forms of child maltreatment or child abuse, including neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, exploitation, emotional abuse, and medical abuse. So let's look at child neglect. What is child neglect? Child neglect refers to a failure to provide adequate food, shelter, affection, supervision, education, or denial of medical care. Now, when we move on to looking at physical abuse, this is one that sometimes most people are quite familiar with. But when we speak of physical abuse, it's abuse that occurs when a child is purposely physically injured or put at risk of harm by another person. The person can be another adult, it can be another caregiver. As long as they're put into the harm of another person, it is physical child abuse. Now let's move on to another familiar one, sexual child abuse. This refers to any sexual activity with a child, including fondling, oral genital contact, intercourse, exploitation, or exposure to child pornography. And then we also can look at another familiar form of child abuse that you might have heard of before. This is emotional child abuse. Emotional child abuse means injuring a child's self-esteem or emotional well-being. It includes verbal and emotional assault, such as continually belittling or berating a child, as well as isolating, ignoring, or rejecting a child. And then we can also look at medical child abuse. This occurs when someone gives false information about illness in a child that requires medical attention, putting the child at risk of injury and unnecessary medical care. So now that we have understood the forms of child abuse, now we really want to understand How can we act in a spirit of tolerance when treating with children who are traumatized? Many times, abuse causes trauma. Trauma more refers to the psychological aspect of an individual, and many times, trauma has a long term effect. So, let's seek to understand a little bit more. When dealing with traumatized children, either as a friend, parent, or caregiver, for example, it is important to exercise tolerance. Now, you may wonder, what does tolerance really mean? To be tolerant means that you accept other people's opinions and preferences, even if they live in a way that you do not agree with. It means appreciating the perspectives and behaviors of traumatized children, even when you don't understand nor do you agree with the things that they do. And quite frankly, at times, traumatized children, they behave quite differently from children who do not experience trauma. And sometimes you may think that the things that they're doing are weird, but when you seek to understand where they're coming from, or understanding why they're behaving that way, then you're able to treat them a little bit more with a spirit of tolerance. Trauma for a child is actual or perceived threat to life or physical well being of the child, or it can be the threat to someone important in the child's life. It can be an event which causes a sense of terror, horror, and helplessness for the child, and even an event which overwhelms a child's capacity to cope. We all have different capacities in our coping mechanism, and so it's quite important to recognize that at times we may feel overwhelmed, and it's the same thing that happens with a child. Trauma can also be a single event or chronic, which means that there are multiple traumatic events, or it can even be a complex event, which means that trauma results from a caregiver not protecting or caring for a child. And so, as a result of perhaps abuse or neglect of a child, that now creates trauma in that child. So, how can we respond to children, traumatized children, in the spirit of tolerance? Here are some tips for dealing with traumatized children in the spirit of tolerance. Now, these tips can be utilized by caregivers, teachers, friends, community leaders, anyone who may come into contact with a traumatized child. So, the first one, make a personal commitment to increase one's self awareness and recognize traumatic situations. So it starts with a personal commitment. The second tip is seek to understand the impact of trauma. Now, the impact of trauma varies from one child to the other. So, having a broad based understanding or appreciating that it varies from one child to the other would help whenever you come into contact with a traumatized child. The third tip is recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma, and there are quite a few. So it's good to become familiar with researching what are the signs and symptoms of trauma. A fourth tip is respond in ways that supports the child without further traumatizing the child. So, whenever you're intervening with a traumatized child, it's important to remember to be very mindful of how you do such so that it would not further traumatize the child, causing a complex trauma for that child. The fifth point is understand the impact of the child's trauma on their personal self-care. Sometimes, based on the level or the impact of the trauma, it may cause a child to not utilize good self-care tips. And so one must understand how trauma actually influences or impacts a child's self-esteem and resulting in how they represent themselves or how they take care of themselves. A sixth tip is showing empathy and actively listening. Children are more open to persons who pay attention, who empathize, and who listen to them. The seventh tip is timely intervening in conflicts and hurtful exchanges when others are not tolerant to traumatized children. Not everyone can recognize trauma in a child. Not everyone knows how to respond to traumatic children. And it therefore means that if you are more equipped, you're more knowledgeable now, particularly through this lesson, of recognizing and understanding trauma in children. It is good to intervene in a situation, if you can, so that the child would not be further traumatized by the intervention of another person. Let's now move into records of child abuse in Guyana. We are now tasked with observing and recording the findings on children who have experienced some form of abuse in Guyana. We will use the available statistics for the most two recent years, that is 2019 and 2020. So let's start. A total of 3,752 child abuse cases were reported in the year 2019. 1,729 of those cases being child neglect and 890 being cases of sexual abuse. In the year 2020, which was only last year, a total of 3,129 child abuse cases were reported. This represents a 16.6 decrease in reported cases when compared to 2019. Between January and December of 2020, 3,129 children between the ages of 1 to 18 were either abused physically, sexually, verbally, they were neglected, abandoned, or witnessed abuse. Now let us further analyze the records by gender and age group. Of the 3,129 cases in 2020, 1,698 were girls. Now, the breakdown of this record reveals that 688 girls between the ages of 14 and 18 were sexually abused. Overall, 632 girls were neglected, 258 were physically abused, 104 experienced verbal abuse, 12 witnessed abuse, and 4 were abandoned. Meanwhile, of the 3,129 cases in 2020, 1,431 were boys. Neglect was the most common type of abuse among boys. 751 cases were the neglected cases for boys in 2020. Of that 751 cases, 674 were between the ages of 0 to 13. 432 boys were physically abused, 127 abused sexually, 104 abused verbally, 10 abandoned, and 4 witnessed some sort of abuse. So let's wrap up our understanding of this topic as we come to a close. We want to highlight some key takeaways. So here goes. 1. We want to understand and take away that child abuse is when a parent or a caregiver, whether through an initial harm or mistreatment or failing to act, causes injury, death, emotional harm, or risk of serious harm to a child under 18 years old. The second point is that there are many forms of child maltreatment or child abuse, including neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, exploitation, and medical abuse. The third point is that when dealing with traumatized children, either as a friend, a parent, or a caregiver, for example, it is important to exercise tolerance. Being tolerant means that you accept other people's opinions and preferences, even when you do not agree with them. The fourth point is that to deal with traumatized children, one must appreciate the perspectives and behaviors of the traumatized child, even when they do not understand nor agree with them. The individual must first make a personal commitment to increase their self awareness and recognize traumatic situations. The fifth point is that in 2020, sexual abuse was the most prevalent among girls, while neglect was the most prevalent among boys. Well, students, this has brought us to the end of today's lesson. Today, we learned quite a lot about child abuse and the various forms of child abuse. We will continue the discussion on child abuse the next time we meet. I am Miss Alexander saying bye for now and see you in the next lesson.